Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Kirsten and Christopher Shockey presenting their new book, The Big Book of Cidermaking, Expert Techniques for Fermenting and Flavoring Your Favorite Hard Cider. You're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Kirsten, Christopher, and the team at Story Publishing for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started tonight, there's just a few housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen, but the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and to interact with fellow attendees. And if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered, please post that question in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two little speech balloons. We pull questions only from the Q&A module, so please be sure that you're putting them there and not in the chat. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Big Book of Cidermaking, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. Tuesday through Saturday, and you can purchase Kirsten and Christopher's book and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the U.S. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our featured authors tonight are Kirsten and Christopher Shockey. They are the authors of Miso, Tempeh, Natto, and Other Tasty Ferments, which they presented in person at Greenlight last September, Fiery Ferments, and the best-selling Fermented Vegetables. The Shockeys got their start fermenting foods with their farm-fed food company, where they created more than 40 varieties of cultured vegetables and krauts. Their current focus is on teaching the art of fermenting vegetables to others through classes and workshops at their farm. They live on a 40-acre hillside homestead in the Applegate Valley of Southern Oregon. Their new book, The Big Book of Cidermaking, is the most comprehensive guide to home cider making available. This thorough, thoughtful handbook is an empowering guide for every cider maker, from the beginner seeking foundational techniques and tips to the intermediate cider crafter who wants to expand their skills. Kirsten and Christopher are going to start us off with a cider making demo, and then they'll be talking with each other and with all of you. Please take it away, Kirsten and Christopher.
Thank you, Katie. Hi there. We are coming to you from our commercial kitchen in Applegate, Oregon, where right now it is a cider making space. Christopher's been pressing a bunch of cider in that cider press that you can kind of see off in the distance, and yeah, we're going to show you how to easily make some cider today. Let's use the chat, and I'd just like to take a poll of how many of you here have made some cider before, or you're just curious and you've made nothing. So love to just kind of get a sense of your cider making experience. All right. Does that mean everybody is brand new to cider making? No experience. All right, we will get you going. Christopher will just start with, what is cider? None here either. Okay, great.
No worries. So in most of the world, when you say cider, they think of the alcoholic fermented kind. In the United States and Australia, when you say cider, it actually refers to the sweet cider. So in this country, after Prohibition, everything switched. And when we say cider, it meant hard cider meant the fermented alcoholic kind, and sweet cider or cider meant the juice that was freshly pressed. We're trying to change that and get back to the way the rest of the world sees cider, which is cider is the fermented version and juice is the fresh squeezed version. So when we're talking about cider today, we're going to be talking about the fermented version of that. So we have some things to show you, but we want to start out with just how simple, since a lot of people are brand new, we're going to show you how simple it is to make your own cider. So
and one more thing, sorry. Let's since you guys are brand new and since we would love this to be really interactive like it would be if we were live in a bookstore, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to have a conversation with all of us here on the call.
Yeah, any question at all. In fact, it's a smallish group, so any question about any fermentation, anything you want to ferment. We're talking about fermenting apples and fruits today, but if you want to go down that path of beans, grains, nuts, vegetables, we can handle anything. So I want to show you, if you're lucky enough to have apples, and I just grabbed these from a sampling of what we're going to be pressing in the next couple of days to show you on the farm what we're pressing. So we have these are one of the heirlooms that are on the property. These are a Rome. So when you're thinking about your cider, you can think about flavors. So if you're lucky enough to have apples at your disposal, you can look for different things. We have some Macintoshes, and because this year was a drought year, we're in a very big drought. We're also in a lot of smoke. All of our apple trees were really stressed this year, so everything looks like it should, except for it's about half the size. So believe it or not, these are Macintoshes. They should be twice that size. Macs are great. They're a sweet apple on the sweetish side. On the sweet side too, we often have these Golden Delicious. These are old variety Golden Delicious. So we would use those for the sweet end of the thing. We have some apples called Big Reds, which aren't very big this year. But they're a sour apple. So again, we have sweet and then we have sour. We have these little beautiful russeted, ugly things. This is a spice russet. So it has a russeted skin. It's actually a sweet apple, but does really have some spice notes. And then we have a couple crabs that we're going to throw in a cardinal. And this is a crab apple that actually is off the property that came after we were here. We came to the farm in 1998, so this is a crab apple that came up since that time. So it's called the Shockey crab, because when you have a brand new apple tree, you can name it whatever you want to. And it is a sweet sour. Actually, no, it's a sour and bitter. So it'd be called bitter sharp. And it gives it a nice array. So what in the Rome that I started out with, it's kind of a filler apple. It's not real sweet, it's not real sour, but usually they're big and they give you a lot of juice. So in the pressing I'm going to do this weekend, I'm going to use these guys because they're going to give me a lot of volume. I'm going to add some sweets, I'm going to add some sours, and then I'm going to add some of those bitter ones, which are the crab apples at the end. And that gives me a range of juice. I like to, instead of doing separate ones, put them all together and press at the same time. And I'm going to have a juice like this one, which is a crab. You can see this is a run of just crab that we did, and this is the very end, so I put it in a smaller bottle. This one's been pressed for a couple of days. You can see how dark it is, so when you press your own apples, you're going to get a lot of solids in there. It's going to start out pretty dark. I'll just show you this guy. So this is isn't that pretty? So these are pears that we pressed about 6 days ago, maybe a week ago. These were actually dessert pears, old trees that were on the farm. So Bosque and Bartlett. And so what we'll do is then we'll try to blend in later when we see what this tastes like some suckle pear, which is a really sweet pear that we have on the property. And then we might put in some crab apple as well to kind of finish that out. But you can see here, this is what you're going to end up doing. This is what it looks like when it's fermenting away. You're going to see some bubbles at the top. If you watch this little airlock long enough, you're going to see little bubbles bubble up, and we'll talk about these guys. And you'll start to see some sediment in the very bottom. And we're going to show you how to do this. So, if you don't have apples, that's fine too. Here's some organic apple juice that we bought at the store. All you need is a good apple juice that doesn't have preservatives in it. So if it's pasteurized, that's fine. It just, look at the bottom, you're looking for things like no bentonite. You just want just preservative-free apple juice. And so what we have to do to turn this into cider is add some yeast. And you have two options there. You can purchase little yeast. Red Star is probably the easiest one for you to find. It's in brew shops, it's online. The easiest one really to start with is this one. It's in a yellow package. It's called champagne yeast. You're into it for maybe 70 cents for a package of yeast. And this will make 6 gallons altogether. So, you know, just a half teaspoon to a teaspoon is more than enough to add to this bottle of juice. I'd pour it in, give it a little swirl, and put a lid on it, which is this water gap we'll talk about in a bit, and you're actually done. That yeast will hydrate in about an hour. It'll start working in room temperature. So we're in a commercial kitchen right now, so it stays in the mid 60s all year long. And so in that cool temperature, you can see it started to work here after a couple of, it'll start working after a couple of days. You'll get foam coming up here, maybe after a week. And you'll just watch it. It'll be on your counter or someplace cool. And for a jar like this, it will convert all those sugars to alcohol in about 3 weeks, probably.
We've got a question. What's the difference between this yeast and regular baking yeast?
So this yeast is officially Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is a brewing yeast, which is actually the brewing yeast that you would buy if you bought the same kind of Red Star baking yeast. The difference is the particular species of this is slightly different. So what this yeast does and what bread yeast does is both the same. They eat sugar and they produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. So it's actually what happens in your bread dough. When you add yeast to a bread dough, what the yeast is actually doing is it's eating those carbohydrates in the bread. It's creating alcohol, which actually gets baked off when you bake the bread. But until that time, your dough actually has alcohol in it. And it has CO2. And what happens in the bread is that CO2 rises, but if you've developed your bread well enough, the gluten strands develop a mat, and the air gets caught in there. And that's why you have those nice holes in your bread. Those are CO2 that's created by these little yeast guys. So can you make cider from bread yeast? You can. What happens is it's really designed, that bread yeast is optimized for carbohydrates in the bread, converting them, making nice bubbles, not producing a lot of alcohol. These guys are more optimized, these strains are optimized for producing more alcohol. So it will make a better cider, but if you don't have these yeast, you could make a cider with bread yeast. Absolutely.
Or maybe it's a good time to talk about wild yeast.
Or if you don't have this, we're going to show you something really special, which is how to do wild yeast. Or maybe let Kirsten talk about how to do that. This is a great thing. Think about this when you're in the city, don't have trees, but you do know where there are a lot of flowers. This is a way for you to make a really special cider.
So traditionally, cider was made by just pressing the apples, squishing them up, pressing them, taking that juice and letting it age in barrels or whatever they used on their farms or cider making houses. And it was all wild fermentation. So if any of you have ever bought, say at a farm stand or at a natural market where you can get either an unpasteurized or a fresh pressed cider, sweet cider, then you may have had the experience when you put it in your fridge and you're drinking on it for a few days. Maybe you're not drinking it fast enough. You end up with a little bit of a funk in the flavor, some bubbles. That's actually the beginning of it moving to a hard cider or starting to ferment. And that is the wild yeast. These apples are loaded with wild yeast. They're loaded actually with all kinds of microbes that will make, lactic acid fermentation, microbes that will make things yucky, microbes that will make things delicious, including vinegar eventually, vinegar bacteria. And so are flowers. In fact, yeast hangs out in the nectar of the flowers, whether it's an apple flower, or a plum flower, or a sunflower, or a wild flower. And those yeasts are waiting to be kind of taken around by the pollinators to other places. It's one of their strategies to help them grow, thrive, and get sugar, which is what they're after. And so while we were working on this book, one of the things that I started to play with was how to make a wild ferment if you really truly don't have access to fresh pressed cider. And one thing I figured out is you can harvest the yeast off of flowers. And so what we've got here is a yeast that was made with, I don't know that you can see very well in there, but there's a little layer of kind of wilted looking flowers on top there. And if you can see maybe there's some bubbles in there as well. This was made with white lilacs. Now, what I do is I make just a small amount. So this is just grocery store apple juice, like Christopher said. It's pasteurized, but it doesn't have any preservatives in there. Wow, it's really bubbling nicely. I wish you could see that. And I'll put that in a sterilized jar and put some flowers in there, and then put this lid on tight, and as it starts to bubble and work, I'll be able to manage it by popping that lid, letting that CO2 out, and also tasting it and seeing if that was a yeast worth capturing or not. And some aren't, and some are delicious. One of my favorites is we do a wild violet cider every spring, and those first little violets that come out. And it doesn't take, as you can see, a whole lot. Now this little starter jar is enough to easily inoculate a gallon of juice. And so what you would do is then at this point is strain out the flowers. You've tasted it, you've decided, all right, that's tasty. I would like a cider to taste like that. Or you've decided, wow, that didn't taste like I wanted, and you're just out this much juice. But yeah, any edible flower you can play around with, and it's really surprising. For example, one year, it was actually around this time of year, the end of the year, the last of the sunflowers, and I realized I hadn't tried sunflower petals. And so I ran down to the garden. We'd already had some frosts, but there was a couple sunflowers that had just opened with, just a few petals that were still in good shape. And I made a jar of this, and we made the cider. And it was fascinating that even with just a few little petals, that flavor that is so sunflower, that nuttiness, like if you're eating sunflower seeds or sunflower oil, and that flavor came through, but in sort of a floral way in the cider. And so it's kind of a fascinating way to discover the terroir of your neighborhood without actually having to find apples. So that's another fun way to play around with cider making, is playing around with capturing wild yeast. And that's the thing with cider making. There are so many right ways to make cider, and they might be very different. A lot of what we wanted to capture in this book was the idea of choosing your own adventure.
Right. So you've gotten to the point where you have some juice. Maybe you bought it. Maybe you blended up some or milled up some apples to make your own juice. But now you have juice. If your juice is not fresh from the apples, so there aren't microbes already on it to turn it into cider, you need to add yeast. And so we talked about your options are you can buy a cultured yeast and put that in. It's very predictable, very reliable. The yeast will convert all the sugar to alcohol. That's why when you see a cider and it says a dry cider, what they're talking about is they've had the yeast and they're long enough, the yeast have drank all of the sugar and turned it all into alcohol. And usually for a juice like this, we're going to get a cider that's around 7.5 to 7.9% alcohol for this sweetness of the juice. Today we're going to show you something else. So as Kirsten said, we have these lovely yeast that have grown in this white lilac, and so we're going to use this instead to inoculate this juice. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour, while straining it, I'm just going to, not even all of it, just a bit of it. In this jug. Maybe you can show.
There it is.
So what that's done is that's just introduced millions of little yeast guys into this. And they've gone from the small container where they've really battled it out for eating the sugar that they had to this giant room full of pastries. And everybody can eat everything. So they're going to multiply like crazy right now. The little yeast divide, and they're just going to fill this jar to try to process that sugar. So the only other thing that you need, you could put the cap on, but remember it's creating CO2. So you would have to be burping this thing all the time to get that CO2 out, which we don't think is a great idea.
I don't know if any of you have done a lot of vegetable fermentation, but if you have, burping works really well because the lactic acid fermentation isn't nearly as forceful and active as a yeast fermentation. So with the yeast, when you're making a small starter jar, it's fine to burp it, but in a larger bottle situation, you really could get, too much built up and have an explosion.
There's different kinds of airlocks. Some are kind of a figure S. Some are like this, where there's a hole that comes straight up, a little cap that goes down, and then there's a top. And the way this works is like a water moat. So the air can come up, down, and around and out, but the air from the outside can't make its way down, up, and into your cider. You're basically blocking out the outside air from the inside. That's all you're doing. So you can buy these are little brew airlocks, probably about $1.50 for that. And then some way to connect it to the bottle. You can go something that sticks inside, like a cork that has a hole in the middle, so a stopper. You can get these guys that fit on the outside, which is what we usually use. They fit on nicely on the outside like that. And then what you're going to do is put your airlock in. And now the important part is to add the water. There's a little line there that says what to fill it up to. You are now a cider maker with cider. Now you have to wait, which is the hardest part. Like we said, probably going to wait 3 minutes. When will you know it's done? After a few days, a week, you're going to start seeing some pretty irregular bubbles coming up through this. Bloop, 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 that kind of thing. It's a very meditative thing to sit down with your ciders and watch them bubble away. At some point, it's going to get fewer and fewer, and then you're going to see none at all. And really, at that point, you can check the cider and see where it's at. Likely, it may be either, if it's all the way finished, it's going to be dry, you're not going to taste any sweetness at all. Or you might taste just this tiny bit of sweetness, which might be something that you really want. When it's ready, you don't need to rack it off into anything else. And honestly, you can just put the cap back on and put it in the fridge and then drink it straight out of this bottle. Pour it. It will still have yeast still working on a little bit of the sugar. So each time you open it, it'll have a nice little bit of fizz, probably a little bit of a pop to give you a little bit of effervescence. And at the very bottom, you're going to have just a little bit of what's called lees, which is basically any solids in the juice and the dead yeast bodies, basically. If you're German, you want to drink those. It's like a Hefeweizen, it's healthy. If not, just don't drink all the way to the bottom.
Or you can bottle it. I'm always surprised how many bottles comes off of a gallon of cider. cider. And that is, we don't have the tube right in front of us, but it's simply taking a tube and siphoning it off the bottom into a bottle. And when it's nice and done, often it'll be clear like this.
Yeah, so this is a reused bottle. This is a Perry crab from 2018. So this is made with pears and crab apples together from 2018. This is the wonderful thing about making cider is you can make whatever you have, store it away. If you haven't drank it in a long time, you'll remember what 2018 was like when you taste this. It'll be something very different. So because of these virtual tours, one thing we've been doing is we've been opening a different bottle every time. And this is what I picked today. So,
We also have a question.
Yeah.
Can the cider go bad in the fermentation process, and how would you be able to tell?
So the question, can a cider go bad in the fermentation process? And if so, how can you tell? Yes, we have gotten nearly all the ways it can go bad. So let's talk about that. Remember that we're using yeast to make the cider, but yeast are not the only microbes in the air that are interested in sugar. There's two others. There's fungi, molds, and there's bacteria. So Kirsten mentioned fermenting vegetables. That's lactobacillus. That's a bacteria that's on all the vegetables. It's possible. It also could be on the fruit as well. Lactobacillus is likely on the fruit. And sometimes you'll get a real big bloom of lactobacillus in your cider. What that looks like, if you were looking at this, it would look like you had a pet squid, maybe, or a pet jellyfish in your cider. It is an awful thing to look at, but it really looks like a jellyfish that's kind of going from top to bottom in there. It's a filament looking thing. Taste-wise, you don't notice it so much, but you do notice that it's like there's a jellyfish in your cider. It's like a bad mouth experience. You'd have to filter.
Right, but a little bit of lactobacillus gives you a sour cider, right?
It does, but this would be a bacterial where it actually goes bad. So you can get that. You'll know when you have that because it's going to look like a jellyfish. What else can you get? There's something called the mouse, which is in this you had an infection of some kind. Brettanomyces is the guy that's done it. How do you know that? When you smell your cider, it honestly smells like what you'd imagine the bottom of a rodent's cage, like a hamster cage, would smell like. It's the same smell. And so some of that will air off. The taste is not great. It's not going to hurt you. It's just not going to be very pleasurable to drink. And again, that's kind of a hygiene thing. Somewhere along the way, you had something that wasn't that clean. That probably let that Brettanomyces get in there. So that would be the other one. The third one would be mold, which we see very seldom. What you hardly ever see a mold infection of any kind, pieces of mold on top. If that's the case, what happened is your airlock failed. So you filled this up and then you forgot about it and the water drained away and now it's air and you got some things that came through and you got some mold in there. So you'll see that. You would also smell it. It'll smell musty, but that's very rare.
When the airlock fails, the other thing that can happen, which is less rare if you get some oxygen in there, is surface yeast. And to some people, when they first see surface yeast, they might think it is mold because it's sort of almost a white powdery looking sort of layer on top. And the thing with surface yeast is it's definitely not harmful at all, but it's not going to give you good flavors. And those surface yeasts are just opportunistic yeast, and they're competing with your alcohol developing yeast, but they're not going to develop any alcohol. So that can be something that goes awry in your ferment as well. And again, that's oxygen. So the first few things, like the bacterial fermentations, just good hygiene, Christopher hasn't talked about it, but a lot of what we do is, besides washing things with hot soapy water, is you can use this is, I think, some gin, right? An 80 proof alcohol, and that works really well to spray things down as you're working with it. Give it some spritzes when you get in to check it, spritz your tube or your equipment, and that will really help keep anything like that from going. And we have another question, which is,
nice.
Will your stressed apples taste any different from your relaxed apples?
Yes. So stressed trees act different from trees. So what's a non-stressed tree? Like a non-stressed tree is I have plenty of nutrients, and I have plenty of water, I have plenty of sunlight. So if someone's fertilizing their trees and they're on a water system and you're somewhere that gets lots of light, so your trees are far apart, likely they're going to be very laid, happy trees. As long as there's not any kind of bugs that attack them during that season. You're going to have sugars that are on sort of the mild side probably, really it's just the apples turn out to be bigger and less concentrated sugars in them, but they're larger, so you're going to have more juice. These little guys, stress trees, so these were, we don't actually fertilize any of our trees. We top dress them with a little horse manure at the end of the year, if we think about it. We've only watered them maybe a couple of times this year because we've been out of water on the farm pretty much. So these are very stressed. What that means is it's kind of like grapes. They're going to have higher sugars. Some of them may have higher tannins. The tree is thinking that it's in a stress mode, so it's trying to set its seed. It's more than ever, it's trying to reproduce itself as much as it can to get that. So we're going to have less juice. We may have some sweeter juice. We may have some interesting flavors that come out of that.
It's really interesting locally. We haven't, we've had some really smoky years. This is one of them. We haven't seen it show up in the cider so much, whereas we are in wine producing area, and the wineries are finding that the smoke flavors are showing up in the wine. So I think it's interesting it doesn't show up in the apples as much as it does in the wine.
Yeah, becoming a thing. Good question.
Yeah, any other questions? Don't forget, all of you that are attending, feel free to ask us a question in the Q&A or in the chat.
I wanted to talk about, so how do you, if part of our book is about the adventure, one of the parts about the adventure is, do you like a still or flat cider, or do you like something bubbly? So if you're coming to cider from the wine world, you're probably pretty used to not having, unless you like a Prosecco or sparkling cider, or sparkling champagne, then you like bubbles. Otherwise, if you're coming from, Chardonnays, Merlots, Cabs, you don't expect any bubbles at all. You can do either one of those with a cider. So if we allow this to go all the way till there's no more sugar, that means there's no more carbonation either, and it's done. And if we just bottle it straight away, it'll be a still cider. So when we pop this, it's going to just not be very exciting at all, and it's going to pour. There'll be some bubbles in the glass because we're aerating it right then. Then it's going to immediately kind of go flat. That's a traditional cider, English style cider. If you're bottling it and you wait until there's still a little bit of sweetness and then you bottle it, that's called pet not. And what you're doing is you're saying, I know you're not done yet, but I'm going to put you in another bottle and let you keep going. It's going to finish out, but all that CO2 is still going to be in this bottle. So when I open this, we're going to have that CO2. A third way is to let it go dry. And as you're bottling it, you put a little bit of, a little tiny bit. For this bottle, I'd put maybe a half teaspoon of sugar, maybe an organic sugar in there. What that does, that feeds the little microbes that are still alive that didn't have any sugar, and again, they'll make the CO2. If you keep really good records, you would know what you did in 2018 when you made this. I don't, so I have no idea if this is a flat cider or if this is going to gush. Now, why would you have a gusher? If you have a gusher, if you didn't pay attention, you maybe bottled it when it was still sweet and you added more sugar. In which case, these little guys have been building up a lot of pressure inside of here. So yeah, I think this is a still cider. So I'm going to just open this. It is. Oh, do you hear that? Just a tiny bit of effervescence. And so,
what other juices can we use to ferment? Could one use to ferment other than apple and pear?
So in the book, we cover all kinds of other juices because really cider is just apple wine, just like wine is just grape wine. So, and perry is pear wine, basically. So what else can you do? Any stone fruits work really well. So we've done apricots, we've done plums, peaches also are great. We have cornelian cherries. Cherries are wonderful. We've done strawberry, we've done blueberry, blackberry. What we'll do is we'll make a base of cider and then we'll add, usually what we do is like 80% apple cider and then 20% those other juices. Usually because those other things are just like so hard to pick that much, or you know, it's expensive to do raspberry cider if you did everything raspberry. So you could do 80% apples and 20% raspberries.
So in the cider world, you'll see those kind of ciders that are a mix of different fruits and apples called modern ciders. Traditional just apple ciders are what people call traditional real ciders. But here in the States, there's so many little cideries making so many wonderful things. And yeah, go around to local cideries or just kind of pay attention in the grocery store to all of the types of things that you can see folks are making. And that can also give you ideas of things you might want to try when you're starting to make your own ciders. I also like to, you know, after this is done fermenting, you can add different botanicals, you know, just like you would with beers or gin or different things. You can actually ferment, you know, keep some botanicals in there on that secondary fermentation, and you're going to infuse some wonderful flavors. So it's kind of a wide open palette, I think, to have a lot of fun with.
Yeah, things like lemongrass, citrus peel, hops, any spices that you like. So this one, we haven't talked about funky yet.
This one's like a good Spanish Asturian farmhouse. Should have poured it like.
Yeah, so Kirsten was saying this, we went to Spain to study how they make Spanish ciders, and a lot of our ciders end up being this kind of Asturian style, funky, a little bit funky. So what do we mean by funky? When you smell, it's not just clean apple, you smell something that reminds you of.
You know, it's funny, more of our old ciders did.
Mm-hmm.
It's tasted this way, and newer ones haven't. But this is an old one, right?
Yeah, 2018. So again, it reminds you of even the way you used to make cider 2 years ago versus how you're making cider today. A lot of people are trying to get this little bit of funk. They like that taste. I do too. It's hard to get it in a commercial cider, but you can do it in your own ciders. And yeah, it just reminds you of where it was. It's a very clear cider. And again, these were just pears off our property and crab apples off our property. That was it. So it's also an extremely cheap way to make drinks, because you know, you get together and pick everybody in the neighborhood, and then somebody rents a press or get one from extension agency, or maybe somebody has an old press. Press it, you have fresh juice for the kids and everybody, and then you also have the makings of some nice hard cider. So let's talk about how long. So, you know, traditionally how this was done is in the fall right now, everybody gathers their apples. We would all press in big communities. We would put them in big barrels, and we'd put those barrels in our barn. And then as the fall, winter happened, it got cooler and cooler. Those yeasts basically went to sleep when it's below freezing. The cider may have even froze a bit on the top, but the yeast stay alive at the bottom. And then in the spring, as that melted, they woke up again. And typically by the time you start working the fields, you had enough cider to pay your farmhands, to keep them happy while they're working. So farmers put away the cider, so the next spring they had cider to kind of lubricate the farm labor through the spring and through the summer, and they drink it all by the summer, and then you'd be making it again in the fall. So there's a little time where you usually didn't have cider, which is in the fall, winter.
Which really is a great place for, we've got two questions, but the one is, how long will the cider last once it's bottled? So in this old way, it didn't last that long because it was very much part of how the year went. In fact, when we went to Asturias, and in the Basque Country in Spain, they talked about, they had these big parties up through May and April and festivals to try to make sure that they moved on the cider because it was just going to get funkier and funkier and more like vinegar. But how long does it last when it's bottled? It can last, we've had some that are...
Well, this one was bottled in 2018, in the fall of 2018, so that's 2 years. In one of the events we did last week, we opened up in 2017, which was very good. It was a straight Perry. So Perry's, if you make it pure pears, they last a little better in the bottle than apples. That said, there's some cider makers who are really challenging all that and are aging just like you do a champagne. They're making ciders that are 5-year, 10-year. They're trying to make the kind of ciders that you would pay a lot of money for per bottle. And they think there's no reason they can't do that. So what they're doing is they're putting more tannins in there. Tannins really, what preserves the cider? There's two things, alcohol and tannins. So if you want it to last a long time, you're gonna find apples that have the bitter. How do you know if an apple is tannic? If you have a neighbor that says, oh, you don't want those apples, they're terrible, that's a good sign. If you bite into it and it seems like you just put wet tea bags in your mouth.
Or an unripe persimmon.
Or an unripe persimmon, that's what you're looking for. Those are tannins. And what they'll do is that they're antioxidant. And so they'll preserve the cider. The other thing that preserves the cider is alcohol. So if you want your cider to last, I would say at least 6%. Probably better to make a cider around 8% alcohol. And then, yeah, it'll last. We've opened 4-year-old ciders. Some ciders will get thinner as they go on and they won't age that well. And some ciders, we have an elderberry and we have a black currant that were real stinkers. They're kind of like some teenagers. I mean, they're now becoming nice people, but their earlier years, they were kind of stinkers. And they've kind of worked it out in the bottle. And the last time we opened up one of the black currants, we were so surprised. It was very tasty. So don't give up. If you make something and you taste it and you think, huh, and you have the space, stow it away, and then in 6 months, open up another bottle and see how it tastes. Oftentimes they'll change in the bottle. Sometimes for the worse, but oftentimes for the better if you're starting out. That's great.
What is the proper yeast to juice ratio, and does that change? Excuse me, is that the same for all fruit juices or does it change?
So yeast to juice, when you buy a commercial yeast, it's going to say on the package what the percentages are. But basically this package will do 6 gallons of juice. So, and there is probably a tablespoon and a half of yeast in there for 6 gallons. Some yeasts are a little bit different. Some will do less. So again, you want to look at the strain of yeast to see what it will do. You know, we just put in maybe a 1/4 cup of wild yeast cider, the starter, into 1 gallon, and that's going to be more than enough to do that. Typically, and you're going to have way more yeast because they're going to multiply, so you're going to have way more yeast than you're going to need what they'll do is they'll divide, they'll grow, they'll eat those sugars, and then basically they'll die and wash out into the bottom. So again, if it's commercial, just check your label and see what it is, but it's probably tablespoon to 4 gallons, kind of roughly, normally, and then wild yeast, maybe 1/4 cup to a gallon.
Or if you're doing straight wild, then you're not adding anything. And there's wild yeast on all the fruits, so if you're doing, let's say, a wild mix of wild apple and wild grapes, or wild, you don't need to worry about the yeast, because all of that will have plenty of yeast on it. So
if you're doing a wild and you've been watching it, and let's say that 2 weeks you haven't seen a single bubble come, it's not too late. So if it just hasn't taken off, you can then add cultured yeast to that and get it going with cultured yeast. It just means that the wild yeast that are in there weren't strong enough to get a nice ferment going. But you don't have to necessarily throw that juice out. You can just add some cultured yeast that'll kick up right away, and you'll still save your cider. But you can't go backwards. You can't start out with cultured yeast like these guys, and then after a week think, gosh, I wish I would have done the wild yeast. I've got some wild yeast, I'll drop those in. The one thing about cultured yeast is it's really bred to be very aggressive, and so it is going to fight for that alcohol, and it's going to beat out the little wild guys in most cases. So that Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a very strong producer, and you won't get any very little wild taste will come out if you start out with the cultured and then go wild.
Any questions? I
Fun
think we're
questions.
starting to get near the end of our time, so I want to make sure we get all your questions.
Anything at all? Any kind of ferment? I'm curious what people think they're going to start with in terms of ciders. If anybody's got an idea what they're going to start out with.
Would you ferment whole fruit, chopped fruit? You want to make a mash, like let's say you wanted to make a raspberry cider here. You'd probably take out some of this apple juice, and you'd make, you'd smash up those raspberries and put them in there. You can actually do both though. Like you could, if you have no access to fresh cherries and it's the middle of the winter and you want to make a cherry cider, you would mix some cherry juice and some apple juice in a bottle or a carboy, and you'd add your yeast in the same way that Christopher mentioned and let it ferment. So you can use fresh fruit, you can use juices, you can really play around with what's available to you, which is, I think part of the fun.
Mm-hmm. I'd say one caveat is that if you're going to have chopped fruit in here, and we've let it go to that point where we talked about where it's pretty much done, what we said before is you can put a cap on it and put it in the fridge. If there's whole fruit in there, what I would suggest is transferring it to another container and straining out that whole fruit. And the reason is because if we were making a brandy, it would be fine. You could have fruit in there because the alcohol is high enough. It's actually going to preserve that fruit in the drink. Cider doesn't have that kind of alcohol to it. So it's not a high enough alcohol to really have chunks of fruit hanging out in the cider as well. What you're doing when you do that is those chunks of fruit are going to float to the top, which are really cool. But as you open it and start to pour it and keep that, what's going to happen is you're adding new air in, and those floating chunks are going to be vectors for mold. So save yourself some heartache at the end. If you do use chunks of fruit, just pour it into another clean container and put that in the fridge. And save out that the fruit's going to be great. Use that for blend up in a smoothie or whatever you want to do. Don't waste that fruit because it's going to be great, but just don't leave it in the cider once you're finished.
I spent time in Peru and we fermented a pineapple peel into an alcoholic drink. It was great. Yeah, I don't know what it's called in Peru. In Mexico, the similar drink's called tepache, And yeah, it's wonderful. Now, I don't know if you remember, but likely they added some sugar to that. And that's back to what Christopher said, to get that alcohol content up, you're going to need to get some sugar in there, because since it's not the whole fruit. But yeah, good stuff. And actually, fermented pineapple peel makes a wonderful vinegar as well. I couldn't help myself. So we wrote a vinegar chapter. I wrote a vinegar chapter, and it was 1/5 of the size of the rest of the book, and it got kicked out. So there's not a vinegar chapter. There's a pomace vinegar recipe in this book, but there's no real vinegar chapter in this book. But it became its own book in May. So if you're interested in vinegar, you can start here, and by May, anything that you decided you didn't love, you can make into vinegar. So,
you can also order that already, so it's already available, home brewed vinegar.
Yeah. So can I comment on vinegar making? Absolutely. So
we do not have enough time left.
Vinegar bacteria likes alcohol, and so that's why vinegar is the big thing that brewers don't care for. It likes alcohol, and but it needs oxygen. So that's part of the reason we have an airlock on here, is to keep away the oxygen. And yeah, what you would do if you decided you were going to make some of this or all of this into vinegar is you might transfer this after it becomes alcohol into a nice open topped vessel or something, with a piece of cheesecloth to keep any bugs out. But basically, oxygen is a good thing. This particular little jar here is what we use. Let's say we're done with this bottle, and we didn't drink it in time, then we can kind of have a continuous brew pot here. There's actually a mother in here. This has got wine and cider in it, so it's a little bit pink. But yeah, the vinegar bacteria are in there munching that alcohol and turning it into acetic acid. And the other, just one little thing I will say about vinegar that's kind of something people don't understand, is that in order to have a good vinegar, you do need to have a solid alcohol. So you can't just take maybe like one of the bacterial infected alcohols and turn that into vinegar. It has to be, maybe it wasn't tasty, that's fine, but it has to be solid. It has to be alcoholic, because like I said, that's what the vinegar bacteria turn into acetic acid. And it has to be at least 5% or more to get a vinegar that is stable. Otherwise, it won't create enough acid to be stable like you would think of for vinegar. You'll have kind of thin flavors and all of that. I think that's the quick story on vinegar. I don't have the time in front of me, but I believe we're getting
24.
We're getting close. So we've got 6 more minutes. Do you have any final words or any final comments?
So cider is super easy. You saw just juice and some yeast, or capture some on the flowers. If you're in the city and you think there's no way I'm going to get sourced apples, go out in the springtime, like Kirsten said, and get some juice and collect flowers, edible flowers, and then make these little cultures that you have, and then just introduce them like we did today into this juice. And you're going to have a really special cider. You're going to get the essence of those flowers in this juice. It's going to come out in about a month. From there, it can become a wonderful cider, or it can become a wonderful vinegar and take it to its final destination, basically.
Yeah, we hope you all are excited about trying some cider, trying to make your own.
Yeah.
It's a good hobby.
Thank you so much, Kirsten and Christopher. That was a wonderful presentation. I want to thank everybody who joined us for it tonight. If you missed any of tonight's event, or if you just want to watch it again, we'll be posting it on our YouTube, so please look out for it there. And don't forget to purchase your copy of the Big Book of Cidermaking in-store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thank you so much, you guys. That was great. I'm going to go have a cider now. I don't know if anybody else is going to go do that as well, but I've been inspired. Thank you both so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Good night. Bye-bye.